The end of the Civil War marked the end of slavery for 4 million black Southerners, but the war also left them landless and with little money to support themselves. White Southerners seeking to control the freedmen or former slaves devised special state law codes. These laws were known as the Southern Black Codes. To understand the Black Codes, we need to go back to the end of the Civil War. With the Confederacy defeated and slavery abolished, millions of African Americans were suddenly free from bondage. But freedom alone was not enough to guarantee their rights and equality. The former slave-owning states in the South were determined to maintain white supremacy and prevent black Americans from gaining political, economic, and social power. Enter the Black Codes. These state laws aimed to control and restrict the behavior of newly freed slaves. The Black Codes varied from state to state, but they shared a common purpose: to enforce a system of racial segregation and subordination. They were designed to limit the rights of black Americans, such as the right to vote, own property, testify in court, or even move freely. In this video, we're going to dive into the dark history of the Black Codes and racial segregation that continues to remain a stain in the history of the United States. After the end of the Civil War, the United States was left in a state of turmoil. The southern states were devastated, and the country as a whole was struggling to recover. The newly freed black Americans were in a precarious position, as they were suddenly thrust into a world that was hostile and unwelcoming. 5 days after the Civil War ended, President Abraham Lincoln was shot. He died on April 15, 1865, and Vice President Andrew Johnson assumed the presidency. The task of reuniting the nation fell on his shoulders. A Southerner, Johnson favored readmitting the southern states as quickly as possible into the Union. He appointed military governors who held complete power in the former Confederate states until new civilian governments could be organized. Little thought had been given to the needs of the newly emancipated slaves. Shortly before the end of the war, Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau. It furnished food and medical aid to the former slaves. It also established schools for the freedmen. By 1870, 250,000 black children and adults attended more than 4,000 of these schools in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped former slaves in the workplace. It tried to make sure that the former slaves received fair wages and freely chose their employers. The Bureau created special courts to settle disputes between black workers and their white employers. It could also intervene in other cases that threatened the rights of freedmen. White Southerners resented being ruled by Union military governors and Freedmen's Bureau officials. They sought to restore self-rule. During the summer and fall of 1865, most of the old Confederate states held constitutional conventions. President Johnson's Reconstruction plan permitted only white persons to vote for convention delegates or to participate in the framing of the new state governments. Not surprisingly, none of the state conventions considered extending the right to vote to freedmen. South Carolina's provisional governor declared at his state constitutional convention that this is a white man's government. By the end of the year, most of the South had held elections under the new state constitutions. Often, ex-Confederate leaders won elections for state government offices and for U.S. Congress. The newly formed state legislatures quickly authorized many needed public projects and the taxes to pay for them. Among these projects was the creation, for the first time in the South, of free public education. But the public schools excluded black children. The state legislatures also began to pass laws limiting the freedom of former slaves. These laws mirrored those of colonial times, which placed severe restrictions on both slaves and emancipated blacks. Neither of these groups could vote, serve on juries, travel freely, or work in occupations of their choice. Even their marriages were outside the law. The white legislators saw little reason not to continue the tradition of unequal treatment of black persons. An editorial in the Daily Telegraph reflected the widely held opinion of the white South at this time. It says, "There is such a radical difference in the mental and moral nature of the white and black race that it would be impossible to secure order in a mixed community by the same law." White Southerners also feared that if freedmen did not work for white landowners, the agricultural economy of the South would collapse. During the last months of 1865, a rumor spread among freedmen. The federal government was going to grant 40 acres and a mule to every ex-slave family on Christmas Day. Although the federal government had confiscated some Confederate lands and given them to freed slaves, it never planned to do this on a massive scale. Nonetheless, expecting their own plots of land, blacks in large numbers refused to sign work contracts with white landowners for the new year. At the same time, Southern whites passed around their own rumor that blacks would rise in rebellion when the free land failed to appear on Christmas Day. All these economic worries, prejudices, and fears helped produce the first black codes of 1865. These codes consisted of special laws that applied only to black persons. The first black code, enacted by Mississippi, proved harsh and vindictive. South Carolina followed with a code only slightly less harsh but more comprehensive in regulating the lives of black Africans. South Carolina's black code applied only to persons of color, defined as including anyone with more than 1/8 Negro blood. These black codes defined the rights of freedmen and restricted their rights to freedom. However, the codes did grant black persons a few more civil rights than they possessed before the Civil War. South Carolina's code declared that persons of color now had the right to acquire, own, and dispose of property, to make contracts, to enjoy the fruits of their labor, to sue and be sued, and to receive protection under the law in their persons and property. Also, for the first time, the law recognized the marriages of black persons and the legitimacy of their children. But the law went on to state that marriage between a white person and a person of color shall be illegal and void. One of the most insidious aspects of the black codes was the way they restricted the ability of black Americans to find work. In many cases, black workers were forced to sign labor contracts that were heavily weighted in favor of their white employers. These contracts often required black workers to work for extremely low wages, and they could be fired at any time for any reason. They were also required to live on their employer's property and could be evicted if they refused to work or if they violated any of the other terms of their contract. These labor contracts were essentially a form of indentured servitude, and they were used to exploit black workers and keep them in a state of economic dependence on their white employers. In some cases, the contracts were even enforced through the use of violence and intimidation. Perhaps one of the most outrageous laws of the black codes was their use of vagrancy laws. These laws criminalized unemployment or the inability to show proof of employment and were used to arrest and incarcerate thousands of black Americans who were simply looking for work. Many of these prisoners were then leased out to private companies as cheap labor, creating a new form of slavery in all but name. The courts customarily waived such punishment for white offenders, allowing them to take an oath of poverty instead. South Carolina's Black Code also established a racially separate court system for all civil and criminal cases that involved a black plaintiff or defendant. It allowed black witnesses to testify in court, but only in cases affecting the person or property of a person of color. Crimes that whites believed freedmen might commit, such as rebellion, arson, burglary, and assaulting a white woman, carried harsh penalties. Most of these crimes carried the death penalty for blacks, but not for whites. Punishments for minor offenses committed by blacks could result in hiring out or whipping, penalties rarely imposed on white lawbreakers. Black codes also prohibited black Americans from owning firearms or serving on juries, effectively denying them access to justice and the ability to defend themselves. They also imposed harsh penalties on African Americans for minor offenses such as loitering, vagrancy, or insulting gestures. These offenses were often broadly defined and could result in imprisonment or forced labor. The Mississippi and South Carolina Black Codes of 1865 provoked a storm of protest among many Northerners. They accused Southern whites of trying to restore slavery. Congress refused to seat Southerners elected under the new state constitutions. A special congressional committee investigated whether white Southern Reconstruction should be allowed to continue. In the South, the Mississippi and South Carolina Black Codes never went into effect. The Union military governors and the Freedmen's Bureau immediately declared them invalid. Fearing that their self-rule was in jeopardy, the two states revised and moderated their codes. Christmas Day came without either the free land that freedmen had hoped for or the bloody rebellion that whites had dreaded. Instead, as the new year began, freedmen all over the South signed labor contracts and went back to work. Under the less tense conditions in 1866, most other former Confederate states wrote black codes that paid more attention to the legal equality of whites and blacks. Along with the black codes, other events helped alter the course of Reconstruction. The 14th Amendment passed, and a new Congress hostile to the South was elected. This Congress took control of Reconstruction. When President Johnson vetoed its Reconstruction legislation, Congress overrode his vetoes. The battles with Johnson ultimately led 1868 to his impeachment by the House, the first impeachment of a president in American history. Under the direction of Congress, most Southern states held new constitutional conventions in 1867 and 1868. This time, the freedmen voted and participated. The resulting new state constitutions guaranteed the right of black adult males to vote and run for public office. For the first time, some blacks won elections to Southern state legislatures and to Congress. By 1868, most states had repealed the remains of discriminatory black code laws. But Reconstruction did not last long. By 1877, it was dead. The North had lost interest in helping Southern blacks. Many factors helped kill Reconstruction. Some include economic troubles in the country, a more conservative consensus within the nation, a general feeling in the country that Reconstruction had failed, the resurgence of the Democratic Party, and a growing respectability for racist attitudes. Southern states began trying to end black voting. By 1910, all Southern states had excluded blacks from voting. In the 1890s, Southern states enacted a new form of black codes called Jim Crow laws. These laws made it illegal for blacks and whites to share public facilities. This meant that blacks and whites had to use separate schools, hospitals, libraries, restaurants, hotels, bathrooms, and drinking fountains. At the start of the 1880s, big cities in the South were not wholly beholden to Jim Crow laws, and black Americans found more freedom in them. This led to substantial black populations moving to the cities, and as the decade progressed, white city dwellers demanded more laws to limit opportunities for African Americans. Jim Crow laws soon spread around the country with even more force than previously. Public parks were forbidden for African Americans to enter, and theaters and restaurants were segregated. Segregated waiting rooms in bus and train stations were required, as well as water fountains, restrooms, building entrances, elevators, cemeteries, and even amusement park cashier windows. Laws forbade African Americans from living in white neighborhoods. Segregation was enforced for public pools, phone booths, hospitals, asylums, jails, and residential homes for the elderly and handicapped. Some states required separate textbooks for black and white students. New Orleans mandated the segregation of prostitutes according to race. In Atlanta, African Americans in court were given a different Bible from white people to swear on. In addition, most Southern states would ban marriage and cohabitation between white and black people. It was not uncommon to see signs posted at town and city limits warning African Americans that they were not welcome there. As oppressive as the Jim Crow era was, it was also a time when many African Americans around the country stepped forward into leadership roles to vigorously oppose the laws. Memphis teacher Ida B. Wells became a prominent activist against Jim Crow laws after refusing to leave a first-class train car designated for white people only. A conductor forcibly removed her, and she successfully sued the railroad, though that decision was later reversed by a higher court. Angry at the injustice, Wells devoted herself to fighting Jim Crow laws. Her vehicle for dissent was newspaper writing. In 1889, she became co-owner of the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight and used her position to take on school segregation and sexual harassment. Wells traveled throughout the South to publicize her work and advocated for the arming of black citizens. Wells also investigated lynchings and wrote about her findings. A mob destroyed her newspaper and threatened her with death, forcing her to move to the North, where she continued her efforts against Jim Crow laws and lynching. Another notable black woman in the fight against racism and segregation was Charlotte Brown. Charlotte Hawkins. Brown was a North Carolina-born, Massachusetts-raised black woman who returned to her birthplace at the age of 17 in 1901 to work as a teacher for the American Missionary Association. After funding was withdrawn for that school, Brown began fundraising to start her own school, named the Palmer Memorial Institute. Brown became the first black woman to create a black school in North Carolina, and through her education work became a fierce and vocal opponent of Jim Crow laws. Not everyone battled for equal rights within white society. Some chose a separatist approach. Convinced by Jim Crow laws that black and white people could not live peaceably together, formerly enslaved Isaiah Montgomery created the African-American-only town of Mound Bayou, Mississippi in 1887. Montgomery recruited other former enslaved people to settle in the wilderness with him, clearing the land and forging a settlement that included several schools, an Andrew Carnegie-funded library, a hospital, 3 cotton gins, a bank, and a sawmill. Mound Bayou still exists today and is still almost 100% black. As the 20th century progressed, Jim Crow laws flourished within an oppressive society marked by violence. Following World War I, the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, noted that lynchings had become so prevalent that they sent investigator Walter White to the South. White had lighter skin and could infiltrate white hate groups. As lynchings increased, so did race riots, with at least 25 across the United States over several months in 1919, a period sometimes referred to as Red Summer. In retaliation, white authorities charged black communities with conspiring to conquer white America. With Jim Crow dominating the landscape, education increasingly under attack, and few opportunities for black college graduates, the Great Migration of the 1920s saw a significant migration of educated black people out of the South, spurred on by publications like the Chicago Defender, which encouraged black Americans to move north. Read by millions of Southern black people, white people attempted to ban the newspaper and threatened violence against any caught reading or distributing it. The poverty of the Great Depression only deepened resentment with a rise in lynchings, and after World War II, even black veterans returning home met with segregation and violence. The North was not immune to Jim Crow-like laws. Some states required black people to own property before they could vote. Schools and neighborhoods were segregated, and businesses displayed whites-only signs. In Ohio, segregationist Allen Granberry Thurman ran for governor in 1867, promising to bar black citizens from voting. After he narrowly lost that political race, Thurman was appointed to the U.S. Senate, where he fought to dissolve Reconstruction-era reforms benefiting African Americans. After World War II, suburban developments in the North and South were created with legal covenants that did not allow black families, and black people often found it difficult or impossible to obtain mortgages for homes in certain red-line neighborhoods. Fortunately, the Jim Crow's laws were not here to stay. The post-World War II era saw an increase in civil rights activities in the African American community, with a focus on ensuring that black citizens were able to vote. This ushered in the civil rights movement, resulting in the removal of Jim Crow laws. In 1964, President Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, which legally ended the segregation that had been institutionalized by Jim Crow laws. And in 1965, the Voting Rights Act halted efforts to keep minorities from voting. The Fair Housing Act of 1968, which ended discrimination in renting and selling homes, followed. Ultimately, the U.S. Supreme Court declared these laws unconstitutional, and the U.S. Congress passed civil rights legislation